Money. It's a word that evokes a lot of emotion in folks, often very different emotions. What is money? Where did it come from? Is it really the root of all evil, as some have led us to believe? Is there a better way? And what can we do to learn from the history of money? You're listening to episode 239 of Queer Money. This week, we're talking to an author, reporter, and podcast host of the #1 Money podcast about this weird, wild, and really made up thing we call money. Plus, stick around to the end of the show for a chance to get a free copy of our guest's new book. There's personal finance for the masses. This is not personal finance for the masses. This is Queer Money. This podcast is sponsored by Capital One. Capital One is redesigning the banking experience by offering simple, straightforward, and seamless ways for you to bank from almost anywhere. So banking fits into your life, not the other way around.
Stressing about debt is so COVID-19 2020. No matter how or when you got stuck with your debt, make 2021 the year it disappears.
Poof!
Sleep better at night and live happier during the day.
I'm a unicorn!
Sign up for the credit card payoff plan between January 2nd and January 4th this 2021 and get a one-time special offer, a free 45-minute 2-on-1
Out of the gutter, fellas.
money success session with us, the Debt Free Guys, a $197 value.
Cha-ching!
Now, on with the show.
Welcome back to another episode of Queer Money. If you are interested in money and love podcasts, but haven't heard the name Jacob Goldstein or of the show Planet Money, you might just be living under a rock. Today, John and I are excited to welcome the host of the #1 Money podcast, Planet Money, Jacob Goldstein, to our little podcast. Welcome, Jacob.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Definitely. We're excited to have you here. So you've recently written a book called Money, The True Story of a Made-Up Thing, which John and I are seeing pop up all over the place since it was published, I think, back in August or September. We started seeing little articles pop up about the book in a lot of different places. So I guess when we think about made-up things, oftentimes we think of things like unicorns and elves and Santa Claus. So then is something so important to us like money a completely made-up thing?
Yes, yes, it is. And also, to be clear, Santa Claus and unicorns and elves are also important.
Yeah, I
just
know.
want to be
You're
clear. I'm not sure from the structure of
Sabotaging
your
some
question,
children's Christmas.
So,
Right. They are definitely important.
it is, though. I mean, it's a fun way to think of it for me, right? Because we think of money as being this very sort of concrete, maybe kind of intimidating thing. It feels like this kind of force of nature. But truly, money does not exist in nature, right? It is a thing that people got together and made up. And not just once, right? It's not just like once everybody was like, okay, let's have money, and then it existed. But it's a thing we sort of have constantly made up again and again in different ways. And we're still doing it. You know, we're still reimagining and reinventing money.
That is an interesting thing when you say that, because when we first saw that title or we first started reading the book and we thought about this idea, this is a made up thing. And I'm like, but I have coins and I have paper. How is this something tangible that I could actually touch? And then when you start to understand the concepts around it, it makes a little bit more sense.
Yeah, I mean, paper is real. Paper is a thing of the world, and metal is real. Metal is a thing of the world. But it's not the metal or the paper that makes the coins and the bills money, right? It's the made up part, the part we are all sort of agreeing on. That's the money part of it. The paper part is irrelevant.
And you talk in the book that, we basically started out with a bartering system, and I think at some point in the history of money, people were carrying rocks around like boulders, and then eventually, it's at some time or another, John Law came into the picture, and he practically created what our current modern economy is today. And so, did that was that all? Was that planting the seed of capitalism? Was this the inevitable path for us to go down?
Well, inevitable is a big word. I don't know if it was inevitable. It certainly is the path we went down. You know, there are kind of lots of origin stories of money. In a way, the book is a series of different origin stories. And, you see paper money being invented in China 1,000 years ago. Coins had already existed by that point for more than 1,000 years. And as you say, in Western Europe, you have this really amazing life story of this guy, John Law, around 1700. He was born in the 1600s and lived into the 1700s. And that was a moment in Europe when you see maybe even all of the essential pieces of modern financial capitalism starting to kind of swirl around and come together. And so John Law is one of the amazing stories in the history of money. And sort of from our point of view, a lot of the origins of the kind of financial and economic world we live in flow through his life.
It's interesting because a lot of us want to look at all of this from our own perspective of where we're at in our point in time. We look back and we think to somebody carrying a 42-pound something or rather on their back, how ridiculous that is.
Yes.
We know that probably some point in the future, people will look back on us and say, you carried what in your pocket? How ridiculous that is, right?
Pennies already seem ridiculous, right?
That's true.
I totally agree.
We all kind of, I think we want to understand it from the perspective where we're at in this point in time. And I think that's why we're kind of curious. These amazing stories that you tell in the book have led us to the point that we're at. And a lot of people maybe are frustrated with where we're at, especially I think many of us in this point in time right now dealing with quarantine and COVID and the economy. And a lot of people want to point fingers and point blame. And oftentimes there's a lot of pointing blame at capitalism for some of these problems. So this argument against capitalism that has created kind of this chasm between the haves and the have-nots on several occasions in your book, especially when you talk about modern money theory, which if you haven't learned or at least read a little bit about modern money theory, I would suggest that you start with this book as kind of a taste of what it is, because it can get very deep. But you allude to all this in your book. Why is it not that money is a zero-sum game? Why is it that there isn't the haves and the have-nots? Why is it that there's just this kind of endless supply, or what many people would consider this endless supply of money?
So there's a lot in that question. So to be clear, in the world, there are haves and have-nots, right? To state the obvious, there are some people who have a lot, and there are some people who have nothing or almost nothing. So there is vast inequality in the world, and it would be nice to figure out a way we could have less inequality. That said, I think a lot of people have kind of intuitive feeling that the world is a zero-sum game, which means, if one person is getting more, if one person is becoming better off, that must mean that more that person's getting is coming out of somebody else's pocket. The idea that the only way to get richer is for someone else to get poorer. And that is absolutely false. That is absolutely not true. And the big important idea in economics, as far as I'm concerned, is the idea, well, it goes under a really boring name. It's productivity gains, right? And productivity gains in economics doesn't mean having a to-do list or personal productivity things, although that's sort of adjacent. It means it's this idea that over time, and especially over the last couple hundred years, we've figured out ways, new technologies, new just practices, that a certain amount of work, whatever, an hour of work, a day of work, an hour of work, a day of work, just produces more stuff, right? If you think of how much a farmer can grow now versus a farmer 200 years ago, it's incredibly more, right? So one day of farming produces hundreds or thousands of times more food than it did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And that's true, all across everything we can think of. People with machines, with technology, are much better at making stuff. And so what that means is there is more to go around now than there used to be. There is more for everybody. Now, one particular problem, or at least one particular fact of life in the US over the past 30, 40 years is most of those productivity gains, those gains that could be going to everybody, have largely gone to people who are very rich, people at the top of the income distribution. And so I think that's part of the reason that people think now, oh, any gains are just ripping people off. It doesn't have to be that way, right? We can have productivity gains that everybody shares in. And over the long run, over the many generations, hundreds of years run, most people in most of the world have gotten better off generation after generation. And that could continue.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you think that kind of the idea of tangibility of money, or at least in the past, the tangibility of money has kind of helped with this idea of money being a zero-sum game. Like if I have $20 and I need something and I pay you for that something and I now have less than $20, we kind of have this idea that, well, I must have less now because I bought something from you, that are because I have a limited supply of money, that if I have to give it to someone else, then my limited supply means that you're getting a greater supply. That's kind of that haves and the have-nots, even though we are purchasing a product.
I do think that. I mean, I think, what you're talking about reminds me a lot of the gold standard, basically, right? Of this idea where money ultimately is gold, or a claim on gold, right? And gold is in fact finite. There's a certain amount of gold in the world. I mean, you can dig up more, but there's a cost to dig up more. And so if I have more gold, then somebody else has less, right? And I still think that people have a kind of gold standard mentality about money, that it is fundamentally finite and zero sum.
Right.
But it isn't.
Right. Well, I think especially now when we think about the fact that most of the money in the world is not anything tangible. It's zeros and ones inside of a computer, right?
That's right. That's right. I mean, I think if you say to somebody, close your eyes and think of money, most of us would think of whatever, a $20 bill or something, piece of paper, or some coins, stack of coins. But in fact, the vast majority of money now is money people have in their bank accounts, right? I mean, if you think of yourself or myself, I know I have much more money in my checking account than I have in, pieces of paper in my wallet. If I have any pieces of paper in my wallet at all, they're probably just old receipts or something at this point, right? And so, what you should think of when somebody says, close your eyes and think of money, is like whatever, a server at, Chase Bank or something, because that's really what money is. It's just a record on a ledger.
Right.
And not even a physical ledger. If you think of a ledger as a book with numbers in it, it's not that either.
It doesn't exist anymore, right?
Right.
Think of, your banking app on your phone, the little number next where it says what your balance is. That is money. That is what money is now. There's not a stack of bills in the bank that corresponds to that number. It's just a number.
So I have to admit, you challenged my old way of thinking, because I've always thought that ever since we left the gold standard, we've kind of depreciated or the value of money. We made it a little bit more fake, so to speak. And then, when we went through the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, we started to print money, ad nauseum. And then we've now got such low interest rates. It almost seems like all of the old structures of money, and to your point, nobody carries, well, we don't carry cash in our wallet either. But I remember growing up, my dad always had several bills in his wallet. That was money. That whole system is kind of changed. Do you see any risks or concern that we don't have the gold standard? We have such low interest rates, and that we are sort of just printing money?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, I mean, the gold standard, I think, was pretty clearly a bad idea. I mean, in the book, I tell the story of how the gold standard largely caused the Great Depression, and how going off the gold standard started to bring us out of the Great Depression. I mean, in terms of today, it is really interesting how for the past 10 years, inflation and interest rates have been so low, even as the government has been running high deficits. And even as, if you go back, say, a year ago, just before the pandemic, unemployment was very, very low. It was at like historic lows, below 4%, I believe. And so you had this world where the government is running large deficits and unemployment is super low, and inflation and interest rates are super low, which sort of shouldn't exist based on the kind of basic economic models we use to think about the world, right?
Right.
The basic models say, well, if unemployment is really low and there's huge deficits, inflation should start to go up. Interest rates should start to go up along with it. It should get harder for the government to borrow money. The Fed will need to raise interest rates. But that didn't happen. And that's like a really interesting macroeconomic sort of mystery. And it does suggest that the kind of basic rules about money and monetary policy may not work quite the way we thought they did.
Do you think that was accidental, or do you think that was somebody smarter than all of us was strategic?
I mean, it's too big for somebody to do it, right? I mean, if you think about inflation, or if you think about even the interest that the US Treasury has to pay on its bonds, like no one person can control that. That's everybody, right? Inflation is a function of everybody buying things. It's a function of, wages. It's a function of really the sort of global economic activity, right? So I think it's the result of great big global forces, right? Like technological change helps make things cheaper, right? Like we've seen with electronics, but also if you're getting more sort of efficiency. Globalization means, you can find new producers that are lower cost. So that keeps prices from going up too fast. That keeps inflation low. And then on the side of interest rates, everybody wants dollars, everybody wants treasuries, but really everybody wants safe assets. There's this incredible sort of search for safe assets all around the world right now. So developed countries like the US can borrow money really cheaply, right? The classic reason you worry about big deficits is that interest rates will go up. People will say, oh my gosh, the US government is in so much debt. I'm afraid they're going to have inflation. And so I'm going to demand higher interest rates to lend money to the US. But that's not happening. People are desperate to lend money to the US. The US can borrow money for what? 1% interest for 10 years. Like, that's a great deal. That's good borrowing,
It is good borrowing, but we have Americans in more debt than ever. And we have the government in more debt than ever. Is that something that can continue?
I think it's important to distinguish government debt from private debt. The US government is in a very different situation in terms of borrowing than a household, and it's tempting to sort of compare them, and politicians like to do that, but they're really not the same. I mean, the US government can print money, essentially. Everybody around the world wants to loan money to the US government. It is possible that inflation could go up again. It is possible that, people might suddenly decide they don't want to lend money to the US government. But that, at least at this moment, certainly, while unemployment is still so high, while, the economy is still in a lot of trouble because of the pandemic, I would say that this is not the time to worry about that. That's a conversation maybe for after the pandemic. Household debt is quite different, right? You can't print your own money in your household. And so that is a conversation that is like, sort of a household by household conversation, and quite different than government debt.
And I think that's maybe why people feel a little frustrated even before the pandemic. I think people were feeling a little frustrated with the way things were going in the economy, because it seems like a lot of these macro effects that are happening in the economy are maybe only helping a smaller number of people. Now, granted, I mean, a lot of us can go out and buy homes, borrow money to buy a home much cheaper, or borrow money to buy a car or the things that we want, put things on our credit cards, all that much cheaper than what we could have in the past. But I'm still thinking about this whole idea of the haves and the have-nots, which many people then turn and, again, point the finger at capitalism, which is a very common thing in the LGBTQ community for folks to look unfavorably on capitalism. I don't want to say everyone, but one of the things that we have noticed is that there's this kind of desire or attempt for folks who are anti-capitalism, or at least on the edge of anti-capitalism, to kind of want to live in this free economy. They don't want to have these exorbitant prices, and they want, whether it's giving away their services for free or offering them at really, really low rates, there's this whole idea of let's get away from capitalism. Is there a way for us to be living in a capitalism system and trying to also oppose it?
I mean, sure, people should do what they want, right? Like if people aren't hurting other people, it's fine. People should do what they want. Like I personally, I'm not fundamentally opposed to capitalism. I think you could have capitalism with more redistribution than we have now. You could have capitalism with a better safety net than we have now. That's, when people talk about, say, Scandinavia, like those countries are very capitalist. You just get healthcare, right? You just get childcare.
Sure.
But like they have firms and they make profits and people get rich. To me, that seems like a reasonable model. But I feel like people should essentially do what they want as long as they're not hurting others. You know what I mean? If people don't like capitalism, that's fair. People are allowed to not like capitalism.
Absolutely. And I think what the challenge seems to be is that the goal is to live in a free economy. So I'm going to lower my rates. I'm going to offer my rates at $0, and I expect others to do the same. But then there's this, and while I'm doing what I want to do, and I'm living in this self-created, somewhat free economy, then I'm going to struggle because I don't have enough money to be able to pay for everything else that I need. And so
right. If you give away your services and not everybody else gives away their services, I feel like there's going to be a math problem, right? And that seems like that would reveal itself fairly quickly. This is something I'm not familiar with. I feel like you guys are much more familiar with this. So, I mean, maybe you can tell me, like, is this a thing you have observed or something that troubles you? I feel like this is a thing particular to your experience that I'm frankly not familiar with.
Well, it is a concern that John and I see or have, especially folks in our community who I don't want to necessarily, they are on that edge of anti-capitalism, and they are hoping for this economy that basically breaks away from the boogeyman of capitalism. And we oftentimes see those are the individuals who lower the cost of their services or goods so low that then they get into a point where they themselves are not able to sustain themselves or sustain their businesses, which then in turn makes them point the finger more at capitalism to say, the capitalism is doing this to me because everybody else is making so much more money than me. And that's why we kind of wonder, are we truly living in a capitalistic society, or is it some other mutation of it today?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about a mixed economy, right? We're basically living in a capitalist society, but the government does a tremendous amount, right? I mean, kids go to school for free. If you're over, if you're elderly, you get healthcare for free, et cetera. I mean, I'll say here's one thing from the book that's a little bit tangential to what you're talking about, but when you're talking about people who want to live in a kind of exchange or non-capitalistic society, it does remind me of a sort of story at the beginning of the book, which is, people used to think that money evolved from barter because it sort of feels that way, right? Like money as a solution to the kind of inconvenience of barter. But in fact, when anthropologists started going around the world in the 20th century and observing societies that didn't use money, that were small, tribes, say groups of people, largely kinship relations, what they found was not so much barter. They found, the groups were largely self-sufficient, but they found these groups had a lot of really strict rules about giving gifts, say, and then reciprocity for those gifts. And they had rules about what you had to give somebody's family if you wanted to marry them, often say some number of cattle or something like that. And they had rules if you had murdered somebody in somebody's family, of what you had to give to that family. And this set of rules in many different societies largely governed the exchange of material things, right? And that is what people now believe is the origin of money, right? This, in a small society where there is not money, you can basically have rules about giving and getting stuff, gifts, that function, that serve the function that money serves for us. And again, I don't know, but based on what you're telling me, it seems like that may be the kind of thing that the people you're talking about are thinking of, right? This nice thing where it's like, I have this service I provide, and then you provide your service to me, and we don't need money. I mean, I think the thing is, those work because those are quite small societies. Those rules are built up over a long period of time. They're enforced by essentially everyone in the society. So trying to sort of create those from scratch in the modern world seems very difficult, right? It seems like that is the kind of thing that I think of when you say it, but I don't know how you get there from here.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring that into the picture here of this idea of these controls or agreements that the tribe or the small group of people have. those are the kinds of things that can oftentimes control the things that we see getting out of control in the world today when it comes to the haves and have-nots. And that's this idea of greed and selfishness, which is something you brought up in the book. If we all kind of went along with this agreement that we wouldn't allow our greed and selfishness to get out of control, then we could have maybe a moneyless system.
Yeah, I mean, to have a moneyless system, you basically either need to have a really small society, like,
Right.
a group of people where everybody knows each other, or you need to have essentially like a totalitarian government that is just, taking everything everybody makes and redistributing it. Like, I don't really think those are the only two ways I could imagine you could have a society without money. I mean, so that, I feel like neither of those is going to work for me.
Right.
Neither of those is appealing to me. I don't know.
Jacob's
Everybody
checking
can
out.
do what they want. But.
Right. It would take a long time to get there and a lot of rules to get there and a lot of agreement
you
on
think
all
of
those
like
rules.
communes, right? People have tried, I mean, I suppose still are trying, right? Like, where they all, some number of people, this goes back hundreds of years, right? In the 19th century, there were these kind of utopian communities, right? Where people would go off to the woods somewhere and try and build their own community and be self-sufficient and equal and whatever. And those don't sound that good to me either, frankly. Like, I kind of get the appeal, but in my experience in life, I don't want to live in a utopian community.
And I guess what we're getting at is on pages 130 and 131 of Money, you say, quote,
I don't have a copy of the book.
No, we're not going to hold you to it.
You can't tell us? You don't have your whole book memorized?
Okay. Almost.
But you say, the important question at the time, and indeed the question we should always be asking is, how can we design a monetary system that channels that greed and selfishness and wile towards socially useful ends and limits the potential harm inherent in finance? So I guess maybe what this is all coming from is, we've talked about the haves and the have-nots, and some people feel like whether capitalism is the best system that there is, even though it may not be a perfect system, some people feel like it's not working for them. So with that in mind, is there a way to do money better?
So to be clear, just to put in context the sentence you read, the idea there, so that's talking about banking, finance in particular. And the idea there is greed is I think a very basic human characteristic, right? And so seeking a world without greed seems unrealistic to me. A better notion seems to be, if we accept that greed exists in people, how can we build, in this case, a financial system that allows for greed, that doesn't try and stamp out greed, but that rather allows for people to behave in greedy ways that are not destructive, right? That are not harmful to the economy as a whole. And I mean, that to me is a useful way to think about this, right? Like, I don't expect a revolution in human consciousness. But I think, there are reasonable arguments that you can do things that frankly sound quite boring if you start with revolution in human consciousness. Like, I don't know, maybe raise taxes on capital gains, right? Sounds super boring, but in fact, capital gains, which is, money you make off of investments, are concentrated very, very, very heavily among rich people, right? Ordinary people just don't have much capital gains. And so if you were to raise taxes on capital gains, the effect would be you would collect a lot more taxes from rich people and not that much more taxes from everybody else, right? So like, this is an incremental thing you could do. You could expand the earned income tax credit, which is basically giving money to low-income people who work, right? That is a politically popular and pretty clearly socially useful program, right? It gives low-income working people more money. It's largely directed now at people who have kids, but there have been proposals to give it to more people, right? So like, boring things are appealing to me in a way that sort of revolution is not. Yeah, I'm a middle-aged dad. I am who I am.
And now a quick word from our sponsor. Capital One's checking and savings accounts have no fees and no minimums. And with one of the best saving rates in America, you can rest easy watching your money grow with no fees to bring you down. You can open an account in about 5 minutes, which means you are only about 5 minutes away from getting your savings to grow with one of the nation's best rates.
Stop stressing about your debt sleep better at night, and live happier during the day. Sign up for the credit card payoff plan between January 2nd and January 4th, 2021, and get a one-time special offer, a 45-minute 2-1-1 money success session with us, the Debt-Free Guys, a $197 value for free.
I agree with you that there are a lot of boring things out there that could be fixes, but I think there's also a lot of people out there who thrive about this idea of advancement and how quickly we can move forward, and that our technology is going to fix everything. But we have examples of how that didn't necessarily fix things in the past, and maybe that's why so many people are struggling in this movement forward. In your book, you talk about the Ludites. For folks, if you're not familiar with the story of the Ludites, they're basically individuals who during the Industrial Revolution didn't want to see advancements in the production of cotton and the production of textiles and fabrics because it meant that they were going to lose their jobs. And I think we're kind of stuck in a place similar to that today, where we see a lot of folks in this new technological advancement into automation, and people are losing their jobs. Do we have to create more systems then to take care of these kinds of folks? I mean, what do we do with the individuals today who are in that kind of... Are we going to have to always rely on government raising more taxes and providing services or subsidies to individuals during these kinds of changes?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Right. So the Luddites, there is this meaning of Luddite today, which is like, oh, somebody who just sort of reflexively does not like technology. Right. But the Luddites, as you point out, they were skilled workers, skilled artisans who made cloth in England in the early 1800s, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of this era of constant technological change and economic growth, really was all about cloth in England, cloth making in England. So they were the sort of first kind of victims in some ways of the Industrial Revolution, and they went and invented this fictitious General Ludd who wrote these threatening letters, and they took sledgehammers and broke into factories and actually smashed the machines that were taking their jobs. So it was very dramatic. And as you point out, I mean, they were not wrong, right? They were in fact losing their jobs to machines because the machines could do what they did. And for a long time, wages didn't go up for workers in England. Eventually they did, and England became rich, and even the working people of England became much better off because of the Industrial Revolution. But it took, generations. And so, as you point out, here we are again in a technological revolution that has harming some people. I mean, I will say, well, a few things. One is, again, if you go back to the moment just before the pandemic, wages were finally going up, right? Unemployment was very, very, very low, and wages were going up for low-income workers. It wasn't just rich people getting rich. Poor people were becoming less poor. Wages really were going up. And I think another boring solution that I like is full employment, right? Like the fact that we got basically to full employment a year ago, even in the midst of all of this technological change, suggests that there is still stuff that people will pay other people to do, and suggests that we're not yet, at least, at a point where the robots have taken everybody's job. So, having, say, the Federal Reserve willing to keep interest rates really low until unemployment gets way back down and wages start going up, that is another boring thing that is a big deal, right? And I believe that can be helpful to working people, to people who are not rich, who live off their wages.
I struggle with this right now because I see folks who are railing against capitalism, and I see folks who are railing against technology, and I see things changing. Fortunately, being in the position I'm in, I'm not one of those individuals who has struggled. But I think a lot of us, because of market forces, are seeing a larger number of individuals, especially during the pandemic, but prior to that, a large number of individuals who appear to be struggling. And we see a larger number of individuals who seem to, because of technology, because of the ability to in some ways not have to pay for humans to process the way we used to, that there is this growing divide, and more, it seems like most people want to blame that on money. If we would just get rid of money, then we wouldn't have this problem. But it seems to be a history repeating itself cycle that happens over and over again.
I mean, if we got rid of money now, we would live in a totalitarian state, right? If we got rid of money now, we'd live in a state where the government took everything you made and decided what you got. Like, I can't imagine what else would happen. I mean, it's hard for me to think of the other option. I mean, I'll say one other thing, that may be encouraging in the context you're talking about. I don't know. Was it March or April, the government, sort of surprisingly, given the way the federal government has worked, very quickly passed this very large bill to help the economy, help people during the pandemic. And it, there were the $1,200 checks. But on top of that, more important than that, there was a very large extra unemployment payments, right? So in a typical state, states administer unemployment insurance. If you lose your job, you get something like $400 a week of unemployment insurance. The federal government added on top of that an extra $600 a week. Like a lot of money, right? So the typical person on unemployment in the spring and into the summer was getting something like $1,000 a week, which, that's like $50,000 a year. That's okay, right? Like for unemployment insurance, that's like a good safety net. And so the fact that happened, and by the way, the household savings rates went up to like historic levels when that happened, right? People were using that money. They were saving that money. And so that, to me, I mean, many bad things happened this year, and the government failed in many ways, I think it's fair to say. But that was a success, right? Like people got money, they saved it, the government got it out to them. Like that was a thing that worked. And so, that's maybe a little hopeful. I feel like you guys are fighting this interesting fight that I don't know, like, I'm curious about your role. Like you keep talking about being in a community, I guess, where lots of people are just fundamentally anti-capitalism. So do you feel like, where do you guys fit in that? I'm curious.
So I don't think we see a lot of people who are anti-capitalist. I think we see some folks who are struggling, and I think I think we have some folks who are maybe lean a little bit more liberal than your typical liberal.
Okay.
And so I think we see this challenge of folks who are, for example, are trying to start their own business. And I'm thinking of one individual in particularly. They're trying to start their own cupcake business. And she's so adamant about donating 20% of her profits to an LGBT cause that she's not able to get her business off the ground. So she's looking for donations to fund her business so that she can then donate money to these nonprofits. And so I think we kind of, David and I personally.
It's like, well, why don't the people who are giving her money just give the money to the nonprofits and cut out the cupcakes? Right?
Exactly. And then I'd be skinnier, right? So I think David and I
I'm not against cupcakes. I don't want a big cupcake coming after me.
So David and I are, we're cis, white, middle class men. We, everything has worked in our favor and we have benefited from that. But we also kind of have one foot in sort of another world where we see that there are challenges and people struggling. And very often I think that the challenges that we see, it's coming at from our perspective, is that for all intents and purposes, we think capitalism works. I don't think that it's a perfect system, but from what I understand, and I'm not the smartest person in the world, from what I understand, it's the best system that we've been able to come up with so far. Could it be improved? Yes. Are there people that take advantage of it? Yes. Are there people that are being left behind? Yes. And so with that in mind, we're just trying to figure out, is there a way that maybe it's messaging to our community? Maybe it's more education and explanation of how money works and how it can benefit more people, or at least capitalism. Or maybe it is that the system is completely broken and we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start something altogether new. And that's kind of where we're coming from.
It would be easier to make the case in like 1968 that you guys are trying to make. It sounds like, that was a time when for the, 20 years before that, income inequality had been falling, right? Like the decades after the Second World War were a time when the middle class was getting richer, and the rich were, if not getting poorer, like getting richer slower than everybody else, right? So it was sort of the opposite of now. I do think it's harder to make the case for, economic growth being good for everybody after 30 or 40 years when economic growth has mostly been good for really rich people. And like, I'm a reporter, I like telling stories. I'm not I don't want to make an argument or be an apologist for capitalism or anything like that. But I do think people who do want to do those things would be suited, it would benefit them to figure out a way for people with less money to start benefiting more, right? Like if you really believe in capitalism and economic growth, then it would behoove you to figure out how people at the bottom of the income distribution could benefit more from capitalism and economic growth than they have been.
Right.
So it's understandable why lots of people are angry and think the system isn't working, because it's clearly not working for lots of people.
Absolutely. Right. And I think my point is that even if it's not a perfect system and it's not benefiting everybody, it's probably easier to get on board and help influence it than it is to try to change it, right? As an individual, right? We're not all in Washington that has a lot of influence. So maybe it's just better to hop on board, and to the extent that you can as an individual in your circle of influence, try to make capitalism benefit more people in your neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, again, I do think people should do what they want as long as they're not hurting other people. If people want to preach revolution, that's okay. I believe in ideas.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things we brought out at the beginning was this idea of we all are looking at this from our own viewpoint, right? Where we stand in the socioeconomic structure is going to kind of have an influence on how we see and perceive capitalism, or how we see and perceive what is going on with the monetary systems. And the thing that I love about the book is that there's so many of these stories that are woven into your discussion about how money has changed over the centuries and millennia. And oftentimes I think that we get so stuck in our own viewpoint, or we get stuck in our own the stories that we have been told. We don't explore the other stories that help us understand how we got to the point we're at today, and what we can learn from other people's stories to help our lives get better or help the lives of others get better. And instead, we just use our own lens to point fingers at, or to complain, or to get disappointed or upset or frustrated or depressed about where we're at. And it's the idea of sharing these stories that help us understand how other people have taken the exact same system that we're both in, and some people have used it to their advantage and some people haven't been able to.
Yeah. And I mean, even beyond the lens of inequality that we've been talking about, I mean, one of the really interesting things when you look at history and read these different stories is you realize that the world has worked many different ways. Money has worked many different ways. It really is, a choice. Money, the way money works is a set of choices that we're all making. So to some extent, the people who you're talking about who, want to do things really differently, like, they might be inspired by the book in some way, because money has changed a lot, and people have, gotten together and said, we're going to change the way money works, and they have succeeded. Like, money will not continue to work the way it works now. It will be really different in the future. We just don't know how, but change is possible and ultimately inevitable.
Right. Well, we almost kind of see that change happening now, right? We talked about the Ludites and technology revolution that we're in, and you alluded to this in your book, and we also read it in Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens*, referencing something that he calls sort of the useless class, because technology is going to become so ubiquitous, and because that's going to put a lot of people out of work. There's, the challenges. What do we do with all of these folks who don't necessarily fit into the current economy based on their skills or the value that they're able to add at that point in time? Where do you kind of see that transitioning, and what do you think might be a solution to help address those people's concerns?
Well, I should say it's not obvious that is going to happen, right? There is this notion, well, what if computers, robots can do all the things that people do? It's possible that will happen, but it is also the case that in one form or another, that has been happening for the last basically 200 years, more now, 220 or so years, where you have new technologies that come in and do work that people used to do. But what happens over time is those new technologies make the things cheaper. The tractor makes food cheaper. The flying shuttle makes clothes cheaper. And so everybody has more money to buy new stuff, right? To buy more books, to whatever, listen to podcasts, to subscribe to Netflix, to get a personal trainer. And so you get new jobs that didn't exist before, right? So at least what we have seen for hundreds of years of technological changes, machines do new jobs that people couldn't do, and then new jobs are created. So I am not convinced that there will be a large useless class. Again, just a year ago, with all the technology we have, unemployment was below 4% and wages were going up, even, for ordinary working people. So I'm not sold on the idea that robots are going to take our jobs.
I shouldn't be afraid.
Well, I'll give a cheer for that, because I just hope that they don't. John and I have kind of talked about this too. Who's going to take care of all the robots, right? I mean,
well, we know that being a computer programmer is a good job. Although computer programmers talk about the possibility of basically computers being able to program computers, or computer programming becoming sort of semi-automated so that you don't need a skilled person for that, right? I had an interesting conversation with a coder who was like, well, what if you could write the code to write code? Then nobody would need to write code anymore.
And then like 100,000 years from now, we're living in the Battlestar Galactica.
Right? Or WALL-E. Remember in WALL-E where the guys just sitting in the chairs and in space and not doing anything?
We talk about WALL-E a lot. Right. So it sounds like you're more aligned with thinking that technology will sort of birth new jobs and careers for people in a way that we're not necessarily able to envision right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good chance of that. Like, it is also important. It's possible that will happen, but that it's also very likely that lots of people will be displaced along the way, right? I mean, clearly that has already happened. And from trade as well, frankly, right? There was this very good series of economic papers that talked about the China shock, where when China entered the World Trade Organization around the turn of this century, lots of communities in the US that had manufactured things that were now coming from China were harmed, right? And this is the kind of thing that is obvious to a normal person, but that economists have to sort of discover for themselves. But they did discover it, and it was compelling. And the guy who wrote those papers is a thoughtful economist, and he was like, well, look, what we need to get better at is helping people in the transition, right? Like, clearly the economy goes on. There are still things to do, but we should get better at helping people who are, concretely and immediately harmed, whose factories close because a new one in China is making the cheaper thing. We should do more for those people, and we should think about technological change that way too. Not oh, nobody's going to have a job. We need some, vast idea about that. Let's think about like each group of people as they lose a job. Like, how can we be more helpful now to people who lose their jobs?
Right. And I think that's the messaging that kind of gets lost on 24-hour news networks, right? Somebody says we need to break away from coal, and all of a sudden everybody who works in coal is thinking that this politician just wants to put me out of work. And that's, there's some messaging that's getting missed in there, but it doesn't actually get clicks and eyeballs.
Yes. I mean, we can't fix cable news.
No.
That's why we're on podcasts.
Yeah, that's right.
So we just have two last kind of fun questions for you. Because of your experience of doing all this research around money, we're kind of curious, if you look into your crystal ball, what do you see the future of money looking like? I know towards the end of your book, there was the discussion of money going to being much more electronic with Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies. So where do you see money going?
So, I mean, my first answer and the most honest answer is I don't know. And that is like a well-earned I don't know.
Right.
You tried hard.
Like a big lesson of the book to me is there are these big changes that most people don't see coming, and that really smart people even don't see coming. So maybe I'm really smart and maybe I'm not, but being really smart doesn't necessarily help you see what's coming. So, and that's kind of exciting, right? To just think, who knows? Maybe it's a little scary also. Yeah, it's a little scary also. So you mentioned Bitcoin. I don't think Bitcoin is going to be like the money everybody uses anytime soon. And the biggest reason for that is that, it was explicitly designed to be money without the government.
Right.
Without any government. That was like the dream of the people. We don't know exactly who invented Bitcoin exactly, but it came out of this community that was trying to solve this problem for like 20 years of how do we have electronic money without any government, even without any intermediary. It's just kind of money that runs itself on the internet. And amazingly, they sort of figured it out. Technologically, it's really an incredible thing. But I don't think governments are going to let go of money. And I don't think people particularly want governments to let go of money. Obviously, some people do, but I think most people don't really care. And it's, basically functional the way it works now. I mean, there's lots of economic problems, but you can't blame those necessarily on money itself. So I don't really think Bitcoin is going to be what we all use to buy stuff. Now, I mean, you could say electronic money. We all kind of use electronic money already, and governments are working on sort of making money more electronic. But, as I said before, like if you think of money, you should just think of like when you log into your bank account, that number you see, that's really what money is now. And that is electronic already. So we're kind of already there in some way.
Yeah, I think, as you're explaining that to me, I think when I watch the folks on CNBC talk about Bitcoin, it reminds me a lot of when I listen to some of my friends talk about fantasy football. It's like this thing that doesn't really exist, but we're obsessed with it, and it's a nice hobby, and it could possibly go away.
In both cases, there's a lot of money on the line. So.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I was just looking at the financial news feed this morning before we were starting this podcast, and I see that Bitcoin is approaching back to those highs that it was at before. So what goes down?
Well, it's teens. It's something, $15,000 or $18,000 for one Bitcoin, which is incredible.
I mean,
it's not. I don't know what's going on.
We're sticking with the stock market.
Right. Yeah. Well, and this is to me, if you were to say this is a made up thing, that's where I'm like, wait a second, this is a made up thing.
It feels very made up.
These people are trading a made up thing. So.
Yes. I mean, it is gold. Gold does come to mind with Bitcoin, right? Gold is obviously real, but in the same way, I mean, if you just do a basic, what should something be worth? With most assets, you say, what kind of cash flow will it throw off, right? Like, fundamentally, a share in a company is worth, the stream of future profits, right? But with both gold and Bitcoin, that doesn't apply because there is no profit ever to come off of them. There's no use of them. I mean, theoretically, there's some limited use for gold, but that's not most of its value. There's some theoretical future use for Bitcoin, but like nobody is like building a spreadsheet to get the net present value of one Bitcoin, right? That's not what they're doing.
Right.
Talk about boring.
Sorry, you can cut that one.
No, that's okay.
All right.
Okay, so you'll appreciate this, but we've just deemed you the king of the world, and
I'll take it. I don't want it.
How would you use money to make things better for more people if you had that influence?
Oh, my answers are going to be so disappointing. I mean, for a few reasons, right? Like one is I'm not an activist or an advocate. I'm a reporter. So it's not really my place to make those kind of pronouncements. I don't think I want to be king. As I said, like there are like boring, simple policy things that if what you wanted was, say, to reduce inequality, right? Like you could raise the capital gains tax. You could expand the earned income tax credit. You could make it easier for people to get health insurance if they don't have a job, right? There are lots of like simple, boring things that would actually be a big deal to just ordinary people, where the world from like, if you looked at it from the moon, it wouldn't look that different. But if you looked at people's day-to-day lives, especially when bad things happen to them, like losing their jobs and they didn't have money in the bank, things that would really make a difference. And so like, I'd be the most like boring technocratic king.
No, but I think those are very authentic and real world answers. And unfortunately, I think they get lost in the shuffle. I know that people are working on that in Washington, but it doesn't get a lot of the media attention. And I think it's poignant that you brought that up because I think it's actually quite valid.
It's kind of you to
need.
say.
Yeah.
Sorry to be a boring king, but that was a very nice response.
That's okay.
Well, some of the most successful rulers in the past have been some of the most boring ones, right? They brought people together.
Yeah, Henry VIII didn't go down very well. He was kind of an exciting guy, I guess.
Yeah.
So we lied.
I would eat a turkey leg. I do like the idea of holding a turkey leg, but other than that, not really my thing.
Yeah. So we lied. We do have one more question for you. A couple more questions. Where can our listeners buy Money, the True Story of a Made-Up Thing?
Anywhere. You can go to Amazon if you like Amazon. You mentioned that a lot of your listeners are, well, I don't know what, wary of capitalism or wary of big companies, certainly. So an interesting alternative, there's a website called bookshop.org, and that's basically a way you can buy books online but support local independent bookstores. So, I mean, you can buy basically every book there, but you can also buy my book there. So that would be a place.
Nice. I love it. Yeah, and then how can our listeners follow you and stay on top of everything that you're working on?
Twitter is good. I spend an embarrassing amount of time on Twitter. I'm just at Jacob Goldstein. It's just my name.
Awesome.
Nice. And you're also the host of the Planet Money podcast on NPR.
Yeah.
They can also follow you there.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Jacob.
Yes. This
has been very informative for us. Like we said, we thoroughly enjoyed the book. We learned a ton ourselves, even though we've been in finance for, let's not talk about it. And this has been a very...
It's amazing how long it is now, right? Like, how do I have friends from 25 years ago? What does that even mean?
Yeah, suddenly we're feeling older and not necessarily so much wiser.
Yeah.
But we're getting there. So thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you coming on the show, and we appreciate having you.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much.
How does your bank support the LGBT community? Not at all? For Pride in June? Or 365 days a year? Capital One proudly supports the LGBT community throughout the year. Maybe it's time to support a bank that supports us. Go to debtfreeguys.com/cafe for more info. Whether you believe money is good or bad or just is, one thing is for sure. Money has a crazy impact on all of us. Thanks again for listening and sharing the Queer Money podcast. Here's your Queer Money takeaway this week. Take some time to learn the history of money, especially if you'd like to change the way money impacts your life. That hokey PSA we all make fun of isn't just a joke. The more we know about money, the more we can control its effect on us. Get Jacob's book. We thoroughly enjoyed the stories it tells and think that you will too. Now for that book giveaway. Head on over to Instagram and look for the picture of Jacob's book on the Queer Money podcast feed that we published on Sunday, December 6th. Follow the super simple instructions there, and you'll be eligible to win a free copy of the book, Money, A True Story of a Made-Up Thing. Thanks, and have a great week.